The whispers slithered through the funeral home like smoke through autumn leaves, each syllable sharp enough to draw blood. Margaret Lindstrom stood beside the mahogany casket, her weathered hands trembling as she clutched a tissue dampened with tears that refused to fall in the presence of these vultures. The scent of lilies mingled with the acrid bite of judgment, and she could taste the metallic tang of her own bitten tongue as Harold's sister, that witch Diane, leaned close enough for her perfume to sting Margaret's nostrils. "Trash," Diane hissed, her breath hot against Margaret's ear. "Absolute trash. Harold should have left you years ago." The words echoed in the hallowed space, bouncing off walls that had witnessed countless farewells, but none quite like this. Margaret's spine straightened, vertebra by vertebra, as if Harold himself were whispering encouragement from beyond. The funeral director, a soft-spoken man named Peterson, cleared his throat with the practiced delicacy of someone accustomed to family discord. His fingers, pale and manicured, rustled through papers that would soon change everything. But before the will could be read, before the truth could claw its way into the light, Margaret's mind retreated to that September morning 3 months earlier when everything began to unravel, or perhaps when it finally began to make sense. The coffee had gone cold in her hands as she sat in the kitchen of their Plymouth home, watching Harold through the window as he raked leaves with the methodical precision that had defined their 43 years of marriage. Each stroke of the rake created parallel lines in the grass, neat and orderly, like the life they had built together. The morning light filtered through the maple tree's crimson canopy, casting dancing shadows across his silver hair, and Margaret found herself memorizing the way his shoulders moved beneath his worn flannel shirt. She didn't know then that this would be one of their last ordinary moments. The doorbell's chime cut through her reverie, and Margaret set down her mug with a soft clink against the saucer. Through the frosted glass of the front door, she could make out 2 figures, one tall and angular, the other shorter and rounder. The kind of shapes that suggested officialdom, the kind that arrived with clipboards and grave expressions. Detective Sarah Olson's badge caught the morning light as she introduced herself, her voice carrying the flat vowels characteristic of Minnesota natives. Beside her stood a younger man, Detective Rick Anderson, whose earnest face reminded Margaret of Harold when they first met, all sharp angles and nervous energy. "Mrs. Lindstrom, we need to speak with you about some financial irregularities at Hennepin Community Bank." Detective Olson's words fell like stones into still water, each ripple expanding outward until Margaret felt herself drowning in implications she couldn't yet comprehend. Harold's rake stopped moving in the yard. Even from this distance, she could see the way his shoulders tensed, the way his head turned slightly toward the house as if he could hear the conversation through the glass. After 4 decades of marriage, she knew his body language better than her own heartbeat. "I'm afraid I don't understand," Margaret said, though something cold and serpentine was already coiling in her stomach. "Harold works at the bank." "Yes, but he worked," Detective Anderson corrected gently. "He was terminated last Friday." "Mrs. Lindstrom, were you aware that approximately $300,000 has gone missing from customer accounts over the past 18 months? The words hit her like physical blows. The front porch seemed to tilt beneath her feet, and she gripped the doorframe with fingers that suddenly felt numb and useless. $300,000. Harold had said nothing about losing his job. Harold, who told her everything, who shared his dreams and fears and grocery list with equal fervor. "That's impossible," she whispered. But even as the words left her lips, fragments of memory began assembling themselves into a mosaic of deception. Harold's late nights explained away as extra paperwork. The new car he bought with cash, claiming it was from a savings account she'd never seen statements for. The expensive dinners at restaurants they'd never been able to afford before, always paid for with crisp $100 bills that Harold would produce from his wallet like a magician pulling rabbits from a hat. Through the window, Harold was walking toward the house now, his face a mask of resignation that she recognized but had never understood until this moment. The rake lay abandoned on the lawn, creating a diagonal slash across his perfect parallel lines. Detective Olson's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Mrs. Lindstrom, we have a warrant to search the premises. We need you to know that your husband has been charged with embezzlement, and there may be additional charges pending." The next hour passed in a blur of uniforms and evidence bags, of strangers rifling through drawers that contained 43 years of accumulated intimacy. Margaret sat at her kitchen table, the cold coffee now forgotten, watching her life dissect itself under the scrutiny of latex gloves and camera flashes. Harold sat across from her, his hands folded on the scarred wooden surface that had witnessed countless meals and conversations and quiet moments of shared contentment. "I can explain," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. The words hung between them like a bridge neither dared to cross. But Margaret found she couldn't speak. The woman who had weathered miscarriages and job losses and the death of both her parents could only stare at the man she thought she knew, seeing a stranger wearing her husband's face. The silence stretched and twisted until it became a living thing, feeding on trust and exhaling betrayal. In the days that followed, as Harold's crime became public knowledge, Margaret discovered that shame had a particular taste, bitter and metallic, like pennies left too long in the rain. The neighbors who had waved cheerfully for decades now averted their eyes when she walked to the mailbox. The women at Grace Lutheran, where she had served as treasurer for 15 years, spoke in hushed tones that died abruptly when she entered a room. But it was Harold's family who wielded cruelty with surgical precision. Diane, his older sister, called within hours of the arrest. "I always knew something was wrong with that marriage," she declared, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Harold was always too good for the likes of you, Margaret. I told Mother that when you got engaged, but she said to give you a chance. Well, look how that turned out." The irony wasn't lost on Margaret. She was being blamed for Harold's crimes simply by virtue of existing in proximity to them, as if she had somehow infected her husband with moral decay through the sheer act of loving him. Harold's brother Thomas was more direct. "You must have known," he accused during a tense phone call. "Wives always know. You probably put him up to it, didn't you? Always wanting more than what you deserved." Margaret hung up without responding, but the accusation burrowed into her mind like a parasite. Had she known? There had been signs, certainly, but she had chosen to interpret them charitably. When Harold bought her the emerald bracelet for their anniversary, a bracelet that cost more than their monthly mortgage payment, she had been touched by his thoughtfulness, not suspicious of his sudden generosity. When he suggested they take a cruise to Alaska, something they had talked about for years but never been able to afford, she had been grateful for his financial planning, not curious about the source of their newfound prosperity. The questions multiplied in the dark hours before dawn, when sleep eluded her and the house creaked with accusatory whispers. Had she been willfully blind or simply trusting? Was there a difference? Did complicity require awareness, or was ignorance itself a form of betrayal? Harold's lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Janet Morrison, explained the legal realities with brisk efficiency. The stolen money had been spent on vacations, gifts, restaurant meals, and a dozen other small luxuries that had made Margaret feel wealthy for the first time in her life. There would be restitution, bankruptcy, probably prison time for Harold. The house would likely be sold to satisfy creditors. At 67, Margaret would need to rebuild her life from the ashes of her husband's choices. The prosecution might offer a plea deal, Janet explained during a meeting in her downtown office. But it would still mean significant prison time. Harold's age might work in his favor for sentencing, but the amount involved. She shrugged, a gesture that somehow conveyed both sympathy and professional detachment. Harold sat beside Margaret in the lawyer's office, his hand reaching for hers across the polished conference table. For a moment, she almost let him take it. For decades of marriage didn't disappear overnight, and her fingers remembered the comfort of his touch even as her mind recoiled from the implications of accepting it. Instead, she pulled her hand away and watched something die in his eyes. That night, Harold moved into the guest bedroom without being asked. The house felt hollow without his presence beside her, but Margaret couldn't reconcile the man who had stolen from widows and retirees with the man who had held her hair while she was sick with food poisoning, who had cried when they lost their third pregnancy, who had learned to knit so he could help her finish Christmas sweaters for their nieces and nephews. The cognitive dissonance was maddening. This was the same man who had memorized her coffee order and brought her flowers every Friday for 20 years. The same man who had sat beside her hospital bed when she had pneumonia, reading aloud from romance novels because he knew they were her secret vice. The same man who had betrayed not just his employer and his community, but the very foundation of trust upon which their marriage was built. Sleep became elusive. Margaret would lie awake listening to Harold's muffled sobbing through the thin wall that separated their bedrooms, and she couldn't decide if the sound made her want to comfort him or scream until her throat raw. The complexity of her emotions exhausted her more than the insomnia itself. 3 weeks after the arrest, Harold had his heart attack. Margaret found him collapsed in the bathroom at 6 in the morning, his face gray and his breathing shallow. The paramedics worked with efficient urgency while she stood in the hallway wearing the same nightgown she'd worn on their wedding night 4 decades earlier, a silly romantic gesture that now felt like mockery. The hospital smelled of disinfectant and despair, and Margaret spent 8 hours in a waiting room that could have been designed by someone who specialized in institutional hopelessness. Dr. Jennifer Carlson, a cardiologist who looked young enough to be Margaret's granddaughter, delivered the news with professional compassion. Massive heart attack. Extensive damage. Harold was stable for now, but his long-term prognosis was uncertain. The stress of the legal proceedings had likely contributed to the cardiac event, she explained, though she was careful not to assign blame. Harold survived, but something essential had been damaged beyond repair. Not just his heart, Margaret could see it in the way he looked at her now, as if he were viewing her from the other side of an unbridgeable chasm. The man who had always been quick with a joke or a gentle touch now seemed to fold in on himself, becoming smaller and more fragile with each passing day. The trial was postponed while Harold recovered, and Margaret found herself suspended in a strange limbo. She was no longer the woman she had been, the wife of a respected bank employee, a pillar of the community, someone whose biggest worry was whether to plant tulips or daffodils in the spring garden. But she wasn't yet whatever she was supposed to become next. The neighbors' sympathy was worse than their scorn. Mrs. Anderson from next door began leaving casseroles on the front porch with little notes of encouragement that made Margaret feel like a charity case. The pastor from Grace Lutheran called regularly, offering counseling and prayer, but Margaret couldn't bring herself to step foot inside the church where she and Harold had been married, where they had celebrated christenings and mourned funerals and participated in the rhythms of a community that now viewed them as pariahs. Harold's recovery was slow and marked by setbacks. Another minor heart attack, an infection that required additional surgery, days when he seemed to slip away from himself entirely, staring at the hospital ceiling as if he could see through it to some other world where his choices had been different. It was during one of these long hospital vigils that Margaret made a discovery that changed everything. She had been sorting through Harold's personal effects, the contents of his pockets from the night of his arrest, items that had been returned by the police after being cataloged as evidence. Among the usual detritus of a man's life, wallet, keys, breath mints, and receipts, she found a business card tucked into the secret compartment of his wallet where he usually kept emergency cash. The card was simple, elegant even. Riverside Home for Children embossed in navy blue letters, with an address in Minneapolis and a phone number. On the back, someone had written a note in Harold's careful script. Monthly payment, $2,000. Ask for Susan. Margaret stared at the card until the letters blurred. $2,000 a month. For how long? The math began to arrange itself in her mind like pieces of a puzzle that she hadn't known she was solving. $24,000 a year. If Harold had been making these payments for the entire 18 months of his embezzlement, that would account for nearly half of the stolen money. But why? They had never been able to have children of their own, a grief that had shadowed their marriage for decades. Harold had always been tender about the subject, changing the conversation whenever they encountered fringe children or grandchildren. Margaret had assumed he was protecting her feelings, but now she wondered if he had been protecting something else entirely. The next morning, while Harold slept under the influence of pain medication, Margaret drove to Minneapolis. Riverside Home for Children occupied a stately brick building in an established neighborhood, the kind of place that suggested both permanence and benevolence. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and graying hair, smiled as Margaret approached the front desk. "I'm looking for Susan," Margaret said, her voice sounding strange to her own ears. My husband has been making donations here." "Harold Lindstrom?" The receptionist's expression shifted subtly, and Margaret caught a glimpse of something that might have been pity. "Oh, Mrs. Lindstrom. I'm so sorry for your troubles. Susan is our director, Susan Mitchell. Would you like me to see if she's available?" 5 minutes later, Margaret found herself in a comfortable office decorated with children's artwork and photographs of smiling faces. Susan Mitchell was a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and the kind of calm competence that suggested she had spent decades managing other people's crises. "Mrs. Lindstrom," Susan said, rising from behind her desk. "Harold has spoken of you often. I'm so sorry about his health and about everything else." Margaret felt a strange relief at being in the presence of someone who knew more about her husband's recent life than she did. "I found your card in his wallet," she said, placing it on Susan's desk. "I need to understand what's been happening. The payments." Susan's smile faded. "Please, sit down. This is going to be difficult to explain." What followed was a story that reframed everything Margaret thought she knew about her husband's betrayal. Harold had been making monthly donations to the home for nearly 2 years, but not to the general fund. The money had been earmarked for a specific purpose, supporting a teenage girl named Emma who had been living at Riverside since she was 8 years old. "Emma is 17 now," Susan explained. "Harold has been essentially her sponsor since she was 15. He's funded her education, her medical care, her therapy sessions. He's been like a father to her." Margaret felt the world tilt sideways. "I don't understand. How did he know about her? Why didn't he tell me?" Susan's discomfort was palpable. "Mrs. Lindstrom, Emma is Harold's granddaughter." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She gripped the arms of her chair, fighting a wave of nausea that threatened to overwhelm her. "That's impossible. We never had children." "No," Susan said gently. "But Harold did. Before he met you." The story emerged slowly, punctuated by Margaret's shocked questions and Susan's careful answers. Harold had been 19 when he got his high school girlfriend pregnant. The girl's parents had forced her to give up the baby, a son, for adoption. Harold had always wondered about the child, but it wasn't until 15 years ago that he hired a private investigator to find him. The son, Michael, had grown up in foster care and had struggled with addiction and instability throughout his adult life. He had died in a car accident 3 years earlier, leaving behind a daughter, Emma, who had been placed in state care because Michael's girlfriend was deemed unfit to parent. Harold found out about Emma through the private investigator, Susan continued. He was devastated that Michael had died before they could meet. But Emma, she was his second chance. His opportunity to be the father and grandfather he'd never been allowed to be. Margaret sat in stunned silence, processing the revelation that her husband of 43 years had been living with a secret that predated their entire relationship. "Why didn't he tell me?" Susan's expression was carefully neutral. "He was afraid you wouldn't understand. He said you'd been through so much disappointment about not having children, and he didn't want to hurt you by revealing that he'd had a child all along. He thought if he could just help Emma quietly, it would be enough. But it hadn't been enough, had it?" Harold's banker's salary couldn't support the kind of comprehensive care that Emma needed. The girl had been traumatized by her early childhood experiences, requiring extensive therapy and educational support. When she turned 16, she had expressed interest in art school, a dream that Harold was determined to make possible. "The embezzlement started small," Susan said, her voice heavy with sadness. "Harold would borrow small amounts, intending to pay them back. But Emma's needs were greater than he anticipated, and he couldn't bear to disappoint her. She's never known who he is, by the way. As far as Emma knows, she has an anonymous benefactor who cares about her education." Margaret walked out of Riverside home in a daze, her understanding of Harold's betrayal fundamentally altered. He hadn't stolen money for personal gain or luxury. He had stolen it for love, misguided, secretive, ultimately destructive love, but love nonetheless. The drive back to the hospital passed in a blur of autumn colors and racing thoughts. Margaret's emotions were a tangle of contradictory impulses: fury at Harold's deception, heartbreak over the child they'd never known existed, and a terrible understanding of the impossible position he'd placed himself in. Harold was awake when she entered his hospital room, staring out the window at the parking lot below. He turned when he heard her footsteps, and she saw immediately that he knew where she'd been. His face was ashen, and his hands trembled as he reached for the water glass on his bedside table. "You found out," he said. It wasn't a question. Margaret pulled the visitor's chair close to his bed and sat down heavily. "Emma," she said. "Her name is Emma." Harold's eyes filled with tears. "I wanted to tell you." "God, Margaret, I wanted to tell you so many times. But I was afraid. I was afraid you'd hate me for having what we could never have together." The complexity of her emotions was overwhelming. She was angry, yes, but also grieved for the decades of shared sorrow that had been built on an incomplete truth. How many nights had she lain awake wondering if their infertility was somehow her fault? How many times had she watched Harold's face when they encountered other people's children and interpreted his wistfulness as shared longing rather than specific loss? "You had a son," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You had a son, and he died, and I never even knew to grieve with you." Harold's tears fell freely now. "Michael. His name was Michael. He was 28 when he died. I have pictures. I hired someone to take pictures of him, just so I could see what he looked like. He had my hands. And Emma. Emma has your laugh. Isn't that strange? She's never met you, but when she laughs, it sounds just like you." The revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. Emma's laugh sounded like hers. This girl, this granddaughter she'd never known existed, carried some echo of Margaret's own voice. The biological connection might not be there, but Harold had been drawn to qualities in Emma that reminded him of the woman he'd chosen to build a life with. "I need to see her," Margaret said. Harold's expression was stricken. "Margaret, no. She doesn't know about us. She thinks her benefactor wants to remain anonymous. If she finds out about the embezzlement—" "She'll find out anyway," Margaret said. "When you're sentenced, when the restitution is calculated, it's all going to come out. She deserves to know the truth." The truth. Such a simple concept, but Margaret was beginning to understand that truth could be as complex and layered as sedimentary rock. Harold had betrayed his employer, his community, and their marriage. But he had also protected a vulnerable child and honored a son he'd never been allowed to know. Both things were true simultaneously, and Margaret was struggling to hold them in balance. Harold died 6 weeks later. The second heart attack was massive and sudden, striking him in the early morning hours while Margaret dozed in the hospital chair beside his bed. She woke to the sound of alarms and the rush of medical personnel, but by the time they had stabilized him enough for the cardiologist to deliver her grim assessment, Margaret knew that Harold was already gone. The man in the hospital bed might share his name and his face, but the essential spark that had made him Harold, stubborn, generous, complicated Harold, had flickered out sometime between midnight and dawn. He lingered for 3 days in a medically induced coma while Margaret made decisions about funeral arrangements and legal matters. Janet Morrison, the lawyer, explained that Harold's death would complicate the criminal proceedings but wouldn't eliminate the civil restitution requirements. Margaret would still lose the house, still face financial ruin, still bear the consequences of crimes she hadn't committed. But sitting beside Harold's hospital bed during those final days, watching the mechanical rise and fall of his chest, Margaret found herself thinking not about money or houses or legal consequences, but about Emma. This girl who laughed like Margaret, who loved art, who had been receiving anonymous support from the grandfather she'd never known. What would happen to her now? Would the payments simply stop, leaving her to wonder why her mysterious benefactor had abandoned her? Margaret made her decision on the morning of Harold's funeral, standing in the bathroom of their Plymouth home as she prepared for the ordeal ahead. She would find a way to meet Emma. She would tell the girl the truth, not all of it, perhaps, but enough. And somehow, despite the financial catastrophe that Harold's crimes had created, she would find a way to continue supporting Emma's education. It was, Margaret realized, the only form of redemption available to her. She couldn't undo Harold's betrayal or restore the stolen money or repair the damage to their reputation. But she could honor the love that had motivated his crimes, even if she couldn't condone the crimes themselves. The funeral home was packed with an odd mix of mourners. Longtime friends who had come to pay their respects despite the scandal, curiosity seekers drawn by the notoriety, and Harold's family members who seemed more interested in performing their grief than actually experiencing it. Margaret had chosen a simple service, reading from Psalms and sharing brief memories of their life together. She didn't mention the embezzlement or the legal troubles. Instead, she spoke about Harold's kindness to stray animals, his terrible jokes, his habit of leaving little love notes in her lunchbox even after 40 years of marriage. Diane sat in the front row with her husband Robert, her face a mask of disapproval that seemed to encompass everything from Margaret's choice of flowers to her decision to hold the service at Peterson's funeral home rather than the more prestigious establishment across town. Thomas and his wife Linda whispered among themselves throughout the service, their voices carrying just far enough for Margaret to catch fragments of criticism. Should have known. Probably in on it. Never liked her anyway. Margaret endured their judgment with the same stoic determination that had carried her through Harold's arrest and hospitalization. She had learned, over the past months, that other people's opinions were luxuries she could no longer afford. The only thing that mattered now was moving forward with as much dignity and grace as she could manage. But Diane's cruelty reached new depths during the reception following the service. As Margaret stood receiving condolences from longtime friends and acquaintances, Harold's sister approached with the deliberate swagger of someone who had been waiting for this moment. "I hope you're satisfied," Diane hissed, her voice low enough that nearby conversations continued uninterrupted. "You killed him as surely as if you'd held a gun to his head. Harold was a good man before he married you." Margaret felt the familiar taste of pennies in her mouth, but this time she didn't swallow her response. "Harold made his own choices, Diane. Good and bad. Choices." Diane's laugh was sharp and bitter. "He chose to steal money to buy you things you had no business wanting. Designer clothes, expensive vacations, jewelry. Also, his wife wouldn't look like the trailer trash she'd always been." The accusation was so wildly inaccurate that Margaret almost laughed. Harold hadn't spent the money on her. He'd spent it on Emma. But she couldn't explain that without revealing the existence of Harold's granddaughter, and Margaret had already decided that Emma's privacy was more important than her own reputation. "I'm sorry you feel that way," Margaret said quietly. "I loved Harold, and I believe he loved me. That's all that matters to me now." Diane's face flushed red. "Love? You call it love to stand by while your husband destroys himself? You should have stopped him. A decent wife would have stopped him." Thomas appeared at his sister's elbow, his expression equally hostile. "She probably encouraged him. Margaret always had expensive tastes, didn't you? Always wanting more than Harold could afford." Margaret looked around the funeral home at the faces of people she'd known for decades, people who had shared potluck dinners and church services and community events. Some of them were watching the confrontation with obvious discomfort. Others seemed to be enjoying the drama, but none of them stepped forward to defend her. "Trash," Diane declared, her voice rising. "Absolute trash. Harold should have left you years ago." The word hit Margaret like a slap, not because it was true, but because it revealed the depth of Diane's hatred. This wasn't grief speaking. It was malice that had been festering for years, waiting for an opportunity to emerge. Peterson, the funeral director, chose that moment to clear his throat and request attention for the reading of Harold's will. Margaret was grateful for the interruption, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Diane's assault had been deliberately timed for maximum humiliation. The will reading was typically a private affair, but Harold had specifically requested that it be done at the funeral home immediately following the service. His lawyer, Janet Morrison, had tried to dissuade him, but Harold had been insistent. Margaret now understood why. Janet's voice was clear and professional as she began to read the formal language of Harold's last will and testament. The early provisions were standard: funeral expenses, personal effects, the usual legal framework. But then came the passages that Harold had crafted specifically for this moment. To my beloved wife, Margaret, I leave my most profound apologies and my deepest love. She knew nothing of my crimes and bears no responsibility for my choices. Any suggestion otherwise is both cruel and false. Margaret felt tears threatening for the first time since the service began. Even in death, Harold was trying to protect her reputation. But he wasn't finished. To my sister Diane and my brother Thomas, I leave the knowledge that your treatment of my wife during my illness and after my death has been observed and noted. Your cruelty toward an innocent woman reflects poorly on your character and on the family name you claim to protect. A collective gasp rippled through the funeral home. Diane's face had gone pale, and Thomas looked as if he'd been struck. Harold's rebuke from beyond the grave was more effective than any defense Margaret could have mounted herself. Janet continued reading, but Margaret was only half listening until her own name appeared again in the text. The house on Maple Street and all remaining assets, after the satisfaction of legal obligations, I leave to my wife Margaret, with the specific instruction that she use these resources to continue supporting Emma Miller at Riverside Home for Children. Emma is my granddaughter, the daughter of my son Michael, whom I was never able to acknowledge in life. Margaret's generous heart and capacity for love make her the ideal person to provide for Emma's future. The silence in the funeral home was complete. Margaret could hear the hum of the ventilation system and the distant sound of traffic on the street outside. Harold had revealed his deepest secret to a room full of people who had spent the past hour questioning her integrity and mourning a man they thought they knew. Janet's voice continued, explaining the financial details, but Margaret's attention was fixed on the faces around her. Shock, confusion, and in some cases, shame. Diane looked as if she might faint. Thomas was staring at the floor, his earlier bravado completely deflated. But it was the expression on the face of a teenage girl standing near the back of the room that captured Margaret's attention. The girl was perhaps 17, with dark hair and Harold's distinctive hands. She had been crying quietly throughout the service, and Margaret had assumed she was a friend of the family or perhaps a neighbor. Now, seeing her reaction to the mention of Emma Miller, Margaret realized that this must be Emma herself. Somehow, the girl had learned about Harold's death and had come to mourn the grandfather she'd never known she had. Margaret rose from her seat, her movements steady despite the chaos of emotions churning in her chest. She walked toward the back of the room, ignoring the whispered conversations that had erupted in the wake of Harold's revelations. Emma watched her approach with wide, dark eyes that were unmistakably Harold's. "Emma," Margaret said softly. The girl nodded, tears streaming down her face. "He was my grandfather, wasn't he? The man who helped me at school." Margaret felt her own tears finally beginning to fall. "Yes, sweetheart. He was. And he loved you very much." Emma's composure crumbled, and Margaret found herself embracing a granddaughter she'd never known existed, both of them weeping for the complicated man who had connected their lives through his choices, both noble and criminal. The funeral home had erupted in conversations as people processed Harold's posthumous revelations. Margaret could hear Diane's strident voice demanding explanations, Thomas muttering about family secrets, and dozens of other voices speculating about the implications of what they'd just learned. But Margaret's attention was focused entirely on the young woman in her arms, this girl who laughed like her and had inherited Harold's artistic hands. Emma's embrace was fierce and desperate, as if she were trying to hold onto the grandfather she'd lost before she'd even known she had him. "I don't understand," Emma whispered. "Why didn't he tell me? Why didn't he want me to know?" Margaret pulled back slightly, studying Emma's face. Harold had been right. She did have his eyes, but there was something else there too. A resilience that spoke of survival, of a young woman who had learned to navigate the world without the safety net of family support. "He was afraid," Margaret said honestly. "Afraid of disappointing you, afraid of complicating your life. He thought he was protecting you." Emma's laugh was bitter. "Protecting me? I've been in foster care since I was 8. I've been protecting myself for years." The pain in Emma's voice was palpable, and Margaret felt a fierce surge of protective instinct that surprised her with its intensity. This girl, this young woman, had been navigating trauma and abandonment while Harold watched from a distance, providing financial support but denying himself and Emma the relationship they both needed. "He made mistakes," Margaret said. "Terrible mistakes. But his love for you is real, Emma. Everything he did because he wanted to give you opportunities he never had." Emma wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture so reminiscent of Harold that Margaret's heart clenched. "What happens now?" "I heard what the lawyer said about legal obligations and restitution." "Does that mean?" "It means we figure it out together," Margaret said firmly. "Harold wanted me to continue supporting your education, and that's exactly what I'm going to do." Emma's eyes widened. "But you don't even know me, and you're going to lose everything because of what he did." Margaret looked around the funeral home, taking in the scene of whispered conversations and shocked faces. Diane was deep in conversation with several relatives, no doubt trying to process the revelation that her criminal brother had also been a secret grandfather. Thomas stood apart from the group, his earlier hostility replaced by something that might have been shame. "You're right," Margaret said to Emma. "I don't know you yet, but I know Harold loved you, and I loved Harold. That's a place to start." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, financial arrangements, and getting to know Emma Miller. Margaret learned that the girl was indeed planning to attend art school, that she had been working part-time at a coffee shop to save money for expenses, and that she had never known her father beyond the stories told by social workers and case files. Emma had been 8 when Michael died, old enough to remember him but young enough that her memories were fragmented and unreliable. She remembered his laugh, his tendency to draw on napkins and scrap paper, and his promise that someday they would live in a house with a big yard where she could have a dog. She didn't remember his struggles with addiction or the circumstances that had led to her placement in foster care. Margaret found herself sharing stories about Harold, but also about the marriage she and Harold had built together. Emma was hungry for details about family traditions and everyday routines, the small intimacies that create a sense of belonging. Margaret described Harold's terrible jokes, his habit of singing off-key in the shower, and his ability to fix almost anything with enough patience and the right tools. In return, Emma shared her dreams and fears with the kind of openness that Margaret remembered from her own youth. Emma wanted to study fine arts, maybe become an illustrator or art therapist. She was terrified of trusting people but desperate for connection. She had never had a grandmother, biological or otherwise, and was clearly testing the boundaries of what Margaret was willing to offer. The financial realities were challenging but not insurmountable. Margaret would indeed lose the house on Maple Street, but Harold's life insurance policy and his pension benefits would provide enough resources to help Emma finish her education if managed carefully. Margaret found herself energized by the practical challenges of budgeting and planning, grateful to have a concrete way to honor Harold's memory while building a relationship with Emma. The house sale was emotionally brutal but practically necessary. Margaret walked through rooms that had contained 43 years of married life, deciding what could be sold, what could be donated, and what few items she could afford to move to the small apartment she'd rented near downtown Plymouth. Each decision felt like a small betrayal of the life she and Harold had built, but also like a step toward whatever came next. Emma helped with the packing, her presence transforming the melancholy task into something resembling a celebration of memory. She asked questions about the photographs Margaret sorted through, wanting to know the stories behind images of Harold as a young man, their wedding day, vacations they'd taken, friends they'd known. Margaret found herself sharing memories she hadn't revisited in years, and Emma's genuine interest made the recollections feel precious rather than painful. "He looks happy here," Emma said, studying a photograph of Harold taken during their honeymoon in Door County. He was standing beside a lighthouse, squinting into the sun, his arm around Margaret's waist. "You both do." Margaret looked at the photograph, seeing it with fresh eyes. "We were happy," she said. "Even at the end, when everything was falling apart, we were still happy sometimes. That's what makes it so hard to understand." Emma set the photograph aside with the items Margaret had designated as keepers. Maybe that's why he did it, she said quietly. Maybe he wanted me to have what you had. A family. Someone who cared enough to make sacrifices. The observation was more perceptive than Margaret had expected from someone so young, but Emma's childhood had forced her to develop insights about human nature that most people didn't acquire until much later in life. She understood betrayal and abandonment, but she also understood the complex motivations that drove people to make destructive choices. 3 months after Harold's death, Margaret attended Emma's high school graduation. The ceremony was held in the gymnasium at Roosevelt High School, the same school where Margaret had graduated 50 years earlier. Emma walked across the stage to receive her diploma with no family in attendance except for Margaret, who cheered loudly enough to make up for the absence of generations of relatives. After the ceremony, Emma found Margaret in the crowd of parents and families. She was wearing a simple blue dress that Margaret had helped her pick out, and her face was glowing with an accomplishment that felt monumental given the circumstances of her childhood. "I did it," Emma said, throwing her arms around Margaret. "I actually did it." Margaret hugged her tightly, breathing in the scent of Emma's shampoo and the lingering smell of gymnasium floor wax. "Harold would be so proud," she whispered. "I'm so proud." They went to dinner at a small restaurant in downtown Plymouth, the kind of place Harold would have chosen, unpretentious but comfortable, with good food and reasonable prices. Emma ordered the most expensive item on the menu, a celebration that Harold would have appreciated, and Margaret found herself laughing at Emma's stories about her high school teachers and classmates. "What happens now?" Emma asked as they shared a piece of chocolate cake for dessert. I know I'm starting at the Minneapolis College of Art and Design in the fall, but what about you? What are you going to do?" It was a question Margaret had been asking herself for months. At 67, she was starting over in ways she had never imagined. Her reputation in Plymouth was slowly recovering as people learned the truth about Harold's motivations, but she would never again be the woman she had been before his arrest. The financial constraints meant she would need to work, probably for the first time since she was a young woman. "I don't know," Margaret said honestly. "I've been thinking about getting a job, maybe at a retail store or as a receptionist somewhere. I need to support myself, but I also want to be available to help you with school." Emma's expression grew serious. "Margaret, you don't have to take care of me. I know Harold wanted you to, but I'm 18 now. I can take care of myself." Margaret smiled, recognizing the fierce independence that had helped Emma survive her childhood. "I know you can take care of yourself, sweetheart, but I want to be part of your life, if you'll let me. Not because Harold asked me to, but because I care about you." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "I've never had a grandmother before." "I've never had a granddaughter," Margaret replied. "We'll figure it out together." The summer passed quickly, filled with practical preparations for Emma's college transition and the gradual development of their relationship. Margaret discovered that Emma had inherited Harold's dry sense of humor and his tendency to become completely absorbed in creative projects. She also had a sharp intelligence that had been honed by years of navigating institutional systems and bureaucracy. Emma, for her part, seemed to find comfort in Margaret's stability and generosity. She had never experienced the kind of unconditional support that Margaret offered, and she was learning to trust that Margaret's promises were genuine. Their relationship was tentative but growing stronger, built on shared grief for Harold and mutual affection that was becoming less complicated as they got to know each other. In August, Margaret helped Emma move into her dormitory at the Minneapolis College of Art and Design. The building was old but well-maintained, with high ceilings and large windows that flooded the rooms with natural light. Emma's roommate was a girl from Duluth who was studying photography, and the two young women seemed to hit it off immediately. Margaret left Emma at the dormitory with a mixture of pride and trepidation. The girl who had been abandoned by her parents and raised by the state was now embarking on a college education that would open doors Harold could only have dreamed of. But Margaret also worried about Emma's emotional fragility, her tendency to withdraw when overwhelmed, and her lack of experience with the kind of sustained relationships that could provide support during difficult times. "Call me if you need anything," Margaret said as they hugged goodbye. I mean it, Emma. Anything at all. Emma nodded, but Margaret could see the fear in her eyes. This was the first time in Emma's adult life that she would be truly on her own, without the structure of foster care or institutional support. The freedom was exhilarating, but also terrifying. Margaret drove back to Plymouth in the gathering dusk, her small apartment feeling emptier than it had since she'd moved in. She had spent the summer focused on Emma's needs and preparations, but now she was forced to confront her own uncertain future. The insurance money would last for a few years if she was careful, but she needed to find a way to support herself long-term. The next morning, Margaret walked into Grace Lutheran Church for the first time since Harold's arrest. The sanctuary was empty except for Pastor Johnson, who was arranging flowers on the altar. He looked up as she entered, his face breaking into a smile that seemed genuinely pleased. Margaret, he said warmly, it's so good to see you. Margaret had been dreading this moment for months, but Pastor Johnson's greeting was free of the judgment she had expected. I wasn't sure I'd be welcome, she said. You're always welcome here, Pastor Johnson replied. This is your church, Margaret. Harold's mistakes don't change that. They talked for nearly an hour about grief, forgiveness, and the complex nature of redemption. Pastor Johnson had known Harold for 15 years, and he struggled with the same questions that had plagued Margaret. How do you reconcile genuine goodness with moral failure? How do you forgive someone whose choices have caused widespread harm, even when those choices were motivated by love? I think, Pastor Johnson said finally, that Harold's story is ultimately about the human capacity for both great love and terrible judgment. He loved you, he loved Emma, and he wanted to protect and provide for both of you. But he chose methods that were destructive and dishonest. The love was real, but so was the harm. Margaret nodded, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in months. I'm trying to honor the love while acknowledging the harm, she said. I'm trying to help Emma without pretending that what Harold did was acceptable. That sounds like wisdom, Pastor Johnson said. And it sounds like grace. Margaret began attending church again, gradually rebuilding connections with the community she had been part of for decades. Some people remained distant, but others welcomed her back with warmth and compassion. She discovered that Harold's posthumous revelation about Emma had actually improved her standing in some circles, as people understood that her husband's crimes had been motivated by family loyalty rather than greed. She also found work as a part-time receptionist at a medical office, a job that provided both income and social interaction. The work was routine but satisfying, and her colleagues were kind women who gradually became friends. Margaret had worried that her age and lack of recent work experience would make her unemployable, but she discovered that her decades of volunteer experience had taught her valuable skills. Emma called regularly during her first semester at college, their conversations ranging from academic concerns to more personal topics. Emma was struggling with some of her classes, but thriving in others. She had joined the art therapy club and was volunteering at a local elementary school, working with children whose backgrounds were similar to her own. I think I want to be an art therapist, Emma said during a call in October. I want to help kids who have been through what I went through. Margaret felt a surge of pride and recognition. Emma was choosing a path that would allow her to transform her own trauma into healing for others. It was exactly the kind of redemptive choice that Harold would have celebrated. That sounds perfect for you, Margaret said. Harold would be so proud. I think about him every day, Emma said. I wish I could have known him. I wish I could have told him that I understood why he did what he did. He knew, Margaret said. Somehow, I think he knew. The first anniversary of Harold's death approached with a weight that Margaret felt in her chest and shoulders. She had been dreading the date, anticipating a resurgence of grief and confusion that would undo the progress she had made. But when the day arrived, she found herself feeling more grateful than devastated. Emma came home from college for the weekend, and they visited Harold's grave together. The headstone was simple, just his name, dates, and a line from Psalms that Margaret had chosen. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. It seemed appropriate for a man who had been both lost and found, who had made terrible choices in service of profound love. They stood together in the autumn sunlight, Emma's hand slipping into Margaret's as they remembered the man who had connected their lives. The maple trees surrounding the cemetery were brilliant with fall color, and Margaret found herself thinking about cycles of death and renewal, about the way love could persist even in the face of betrayal and loss. "Do you think he was a good man?" Emma asked quietly. Margaret considered the question carefully. It was one she had been asking herself for a year, and she still didn't have a simple answer. "I think he was a man who loved deeply and chose poorly," she said finally. "I think he was capable of great kindness and terrible judgment. I think he was human." Emma squeezed her hand. "I think I can live with that." They walked back to Margaret's car in comfortable silence, both lost in their own thoughts. The afternoon light was fading, and the cemetery was beginning to empty of other visitors. Margaret felt a sense of closure that she hadn't expected, not because her questions about Harold had been answered, but because she had learned to live with the questions themselves. 6 months later, Margaret stood in the gallery at the Minneapolis College of Art and Design, watching Emma arrange her work for the student exhibition. The pieces were powerful and disturbing mixed-media works that explored themes of abandonment, resilience, and healing. Emma had incorporated photographs from Harold's investigative files, documents from her own foster care records, and symbols drawn from her memories of childhood trauma. The centerpiece of the exhibition was a portrait of Harold based on the photograph from his funeral. But Emma had surrounded his image with layers of translucent paper on which she had written fragments of his story, his teenage pregnancy, his years of wondering about his son, his discovery of Emma's existence, his crimes, his death. The effect was haunting and beautiful, a meditation on the complexity of human motivation and the way secrets shape our lives. "It's incredible," Margaret said, studying the layered portrait. "You've captured something essential about him." Emma stood beside her, both of them looking at the artistic representation of the man who had brought them together. "I wanted to show that people can be more than one thing at the same time," Emma said. "He was a criminal and a grandfather. He was selfish and selfless. He was lost, and he was loving." Margaret nodded, understanding that Emma had achieved something through her art that Margaret had been struggling to accomplish through words and actions. Emma had found a way to hold Harold's contradictions in balance, to honor his love while acknowledging his failures. "You've forgiven him," Margaret said. Emma considered this. "I don't know if forgiveness is the right word. I've accepted him. I've accepted that he was complicated and that his choices were complicated. I've accepted that I can love him without approving of everything he did." It was, Margaret realized, a form of wisdom that had taken her 68 years to begin to understand. Love and judgment were not mutually exclusive. You could grieve someone's choices while celebrating their heart. You could honor their memory while acknowledging their failures. Emma's exhibition was well received, and several of her pieces were purchased by collectors who were drawn to the emotional honesty of her work. But for Margaret, the real triumph was watching Emma claim her story and transform it into something beautiful and meaningful. As they walked out of the gallery together, Emma slipped her arm through Margaret's. "Thank you," she said, "for everything. For believing in me, for supporting me, for helping me understand Harold. For being my family." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you for letting me be part of your life. For giving me a granddaughter when I thought I'd never have one." They stood on the steps of the art building, watching students and faculty move through the evening light. Margaret thought about the woman she had been 2 years earlier, the wife of a respected banker, secure in her knowledge of her husband and her place in the world. That woman was gone, replaced by someone more complex and more resilient. "What do you think Harold would say if he could see us now?" Emma asked. Margaret smiled. "I think he'd make a terrible joke about art galleries and then tell us how proud he was of both of us." Emma laughed, the sound bright and clear in the autumn air. It was, Margaret realized, exactly like her own laugh, not because of any biological connection, but because joy had a way of echoing between people who had learned to love each other despite everything. And so Margaret found herself back in the funeral home, 2 years after Harold's death, standing beside his casket as the whispers of trash filled the air around her. But this time, she was not alone. Emma stood beside her, elegant in a black dress that emphasized her artistic sensibilities, her hand resting protectively on Margaret's shoulder. The funeral director, Peterson, cleared his throat with the same practiced delicacy he had shown during Harold's service. But this time, he was not reading Harold's will. He was reading a letter that Emma had written to be shared at the memorial service they had organized to mark the second anniversary of Harold's death. "My grandfather was a complicated man," Emma's letter began, her voice carrying clearly through the funeral home as Peterson read her words aloud. "He made choices that hurt people, including the wife he loved and the granddaughter he protected. But he also made choices that saved me, that gave me opportunities one never would have had otherwise." Margaret watched the faces of the people who had gathered for this memorial service, some of the same faces that had witnessed Harold's original funeral, but also new faces. Emma's college friends, Margaret's colleagues from the medical office, members of Grace Lutheran who had come to support Margaret, and several residents from Riverside Home for Children who had benefited from Harold's earlier, legitimate donations. Redemption, Emma's letter continued, is not about erasing the past or pretending that mistakes didn't happen. Redemption is about choosing to build something beautiful from the ruins of what was broken. My grandfather couldn't redeem himself. He died before he had the chance. But his love for me and for my grandmother gave us the opportunity to redeem his memory by the choices we made after his death. Diane was nowhere to be seen. She had never responded to Margaret's invitation to the memorial service, and Margaret had heard through family connections that Diane was still bitter about Harold's posthumous revelations. Thomas had sent a brief note of condolence, but had not attended. Margaret found that she was relieved by their absence. This memorial was not about Harold's family of origin, but about the family he had created through his choices, both wise and unwise. "I will never approve of what my grandfather did." Peterson continued reading from Emma's letter. "But I will always be grateful for the love that motivated his actions. I will always be grateful for the grandmother his choices gave me. I will always be grateful for the chance to transform his legacy into something that honors both his love and his victims." Margaret felt the familiar sting of tears, but this time they were tears of pride rather than grief. Emma had graduated from college with honors, had been accepted into a master's program in art therapy, and had used her own story to help other young people navigate trauma and loss. She had taken Harold's complicated legacy and transformed it into something redemptive. The memorial service concluded with a reception in the same room where Harold's funeral had been held. Margaret moved through the crowd, accepting condolences and sharing memories, but her attention was focused on Emma, who was showing some of her latest artwork to a group of interested viewers. One piece in particular caught Margaret's attention. It was a small painting of two women, clearly Margaret and Emma, standing in a cemetery surrounded by autumn leaves. The women were holding hands, their faces turned toward a horizon that was bright with morning light. At the bottom of the painting, Emma had written a single word, "Forward." It was, Margaret realized, the perfect summation of their journey. They had not forgotten Harold or ignored his failures. They had not pretended that his choices were acceptable or that his crimes were justified. But they had chosen to move forward, to build something beautiful from the ruins he had left behind. As the reception wound down and the last guests departed, Margaret and Emma found themselves alone in the funeral home. The same room where Harold's will had been read, where his secrets had been revealed, where Margaret had first met the granddaughter she never knew existed. "Do you think we did the right thing?" Emma asked, gesturing toward the space where her artwork had been displayed. "Having this memorial, I mean. Trying to honor him despite everything." Margaret considered the question, thinking about the past 2 years and the journey that had brought them to this moment. "I think we honored the truth," she said finally. "The whole truth, not just the parts that were easy to accept. I think that's the most we can do for anyone we love." Emma nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking about getting a tattoo," she said. "Something small, maybe on my wrist. Harold's initials and the word complicated." "Is that weird?" Margaret smiled. "I think it's perfect. He was complicated. We're all complicated. Love is complicated." They walked out of the funeral home together, into the same autumn afternoon that had seen Harold's burial 2 years earlier. But this time, Margaret felt no whispers of trash following her. Instead, she felt the warmth of Emma's presence beside her, the satisfaction of a life being rebuilt, and the peace that comes from learning to live with complexity rather than demanding simple answers. The parking lot of Peterson's funeral home was nearly empty, just Margaret's car and Emma's college-aged Honda sitting side by side. They stood beside their vehicles for a moment, neither quite ready to leave. "What now?" Emma asked. Margaret looked at her granddaughter, chosen rather than biological, but no less precious for the choice, and felt a deep certainty about their shared future. "Now we keep moving forward," she said. "We keep building something beautiful from what Harold left behind." Emma's smile was radiant. "I like that plan." They hugged goodbye, and Margaret drove home to her small apartment, thinking about the woman she had become. She was no longer the wife of a respected banker, no longer the woman who had once worried about whether to plant tulips or daffodils. She was something new, a grandmother who had learned that love could coexist with betrayal, that redemption was possible even in the face of irreversible harm, and that family could be chosen as well as inherited. The taste of pennies was gone from her mouth, replaced by something sweeter and more complex. The taste of truth, perhaps, or the taste of love that had been tested and found resilient. She thought of Harold, buried beneath the autumn leaves, and sent him a silent message of forgiveness tinged with enduring sorrow. She had called him complicated, and he was. But then again, so was she. So was Emma. So was everyone who had ever loved someone enough to forgive their failures while still holding them accountable for their choices. The whispers had called her trash at Harold's funeral, but they had been wrong. She was not trash. She was a woman who had learned that redemption was not about perfection, but about the courage to keep loving in the face of betrayal, to keep building in the face of destruction, to keep hoping in the face of profound disappointment. Margaret pulled into her parking space and turned off the engine, sitting for a moment in the gathering dusk. Tomorrow, she would go to work at the medical office. She would call Emma to check on her studies. She would continue the slow, steady work of building a life that honored both Harold's love and his victims. It was not the life she had planned, but it was the life she had chosen. And that, she thought, made all the difference.